Bohemia Interactive's Operation Flashpoint is easily one of my favourite games, despite its apparent age and frustrations. Few games feel this immersive and engaging, and while it definitely isn't as well remembered as other tactical FPSs, it still broke a lot of new ground in the shooter genre. The Arma franchise did continue the game's legacy, but I personally feel the original has no equal in its single-player mode. Yes, the future installments greatly improved the multiplayer, but at the cost of the single-player portions. OpFlash and its expansion packs really seal the deal as PC classics, that players with the patience will be greatly rewarded. For the time and still for the genre, the single-player portions of OpFlash contained rather good storylines. All three games are set in the mid-80s, well entrenched within the Cold War. The original game follows the events of a renegade Russian commander, General Guba, who leads an invasion of some NATO-backed islands off the European coast. What ensues is a miniature war with tanks, gunships, and hapless foot soldiers causing all sorts of carnage across the various environments. You play most of the game as Lieutenant Armstrong, a mere grunt at the start of the conflict. Later on, you command your own platoon to undertake more advanced and difficult objectives. Further into the game, you play as different characters who have their own militaristic purpose. A tank commander, a pilot, and a black op, who each have their own missions, characters, and cutscenes, all of which are well directed and voiced, really fleshing out the characters and giving the conflict a wealth of believability. It actually has a surprisingly dark, violent, and depressing first half for the NATO forces. The first few operations go smoothly enough, with you and your platoon securing towns and establishing campsites. Then suddenly Russian T-80s are blasting through your meager defenses and rolling back all your hard work. Shit gets crazy once you're ordered to get the hell out of Dodge, with simple fights going completely foobar. You actually spend a bit of time fighting for hastily prepared local resistance that feels very distinct from the rest of the game. The following missions become a fair bit more laxed in tone and are somewhat disjointed, with you playing tit for toe with Ivan before finally getting reinforced from the mainland, turning back the invasion, concluding with a fairly cliched and quick finale, basically Tom Clancy with a healthy bit of Tom Clancy. But special note to the music that, while infrequent, really heightens the situation in intensity and theming. Hearing that rocking 80s synth metal soundtrack as you rush an enemy-held town really makes it way more epic than it has any right to. Definitely worthy of your iPod. Multiple characters spread across missions? Doesn't that remind me of the later Call of Duty series? The influences don't just end there. Death screen quotes from famous generals also seem quite familiar. The missions of Operation Flashpoint are varied, exciting, well-paced, and very difficult. The difficulty side of things does depend on how authentic you want it to be. Stuff like increased armor so you don't die as fast, and how complex and detailed you make your HUD, with objective waypoints appealing to less insane players who actually want to, play a video game. Before insertion, you're given a very stylish briefing, laying out your instructions on the map in great detail. The enemy positions, directions, the best and any optional paths, the geographical layout of the environment all clarify what you must accomplish for each mission. You can view your objectives and the map in-game, so yeah, with your compass, you can play without any HUD support, which makes the game a hell of a lot more immersive. And difficult. You can browse your fellow squadmates' gear and read the character notes, giving a more human view on the tasks. But more importantly, you can customize your loadout. It's not based on any weight or hit points, and it isn't nearly as intricate as, say, Rainbow Six, but it can make a real impact in some missions where you need the right tool at the right time. Your inventory is made up of slots that can be filled up with stuff like grenades, ammunition, and explosives. Of course, some weapons will take up more space, like an M60 cancelling out any additional weapons, with its large size. Really though, because of the ever-present threat of enemy armor, you want to equip an anti-tank lore in the secondary weapon slot and swap out your grenades for rockets. You're actually only allowed to customize your gear at about the halfway mark. Immediately, you're equipping the M21, because it's the best gun in the entire game. Accurate and powerful, combining it with the lore is pretty much the best counter to any and all problems for the rest of the campaign. Generally, operations involve securing an enemy-held position and repelling any counterattacks. It may also involve clearing the area of hostiles before proceeding. You may be ordered additional tasks like reinforcing allied forces or securing valuable equipment. Most of the missions are great fun. You're given enough details to be prepared, but never enough to be cocky, so there's always a layer of tension when undertaking an objective, regardless of how simple it may be. Be ready for a standard op to change drastically with the enemy, or even your own commanders, throwing a wrench into the works. but earlier stages are far more enjoyable with the pervasive uncertainty that clouds each engagement. Who are you fighting and why are you fighting becomes a lot clearer later on, removing that anxiety. The infantry stages are fairly straightforward stuff. The firefights are usually small scale, but are amplified in danger with the ever-present one hit and you're dead system, so even a small patrol has to be handled seriously. Once you take command over some troops, you gain some very interesting and helpful tactical options. The formations your troops are in and their approach to combat, such as firing at will or return fire only, makes battles a hell of a lot more dynamic. Your troops follow your commands rather well and are competent in holding their own. While it's unlikely you'll build any strong connections with any team member, seeing them nail an enemy rifleman or a tank who are about to ace you is well appreciated. You may have noticed this already, but if anyone sees a potential target, they'll radio in its distance and identity. This makes combat a lot more manageable since there's no way you can observe everything at all times. But they're not that smart. Occasionally I've had soldiers get lost when following me and wind up dead. Because of this, the best tactics involve setting up everyone into a line formation, tell them to fire at anything, and hit the ground once the bullets start flying back. It's pretty important to keep your guys alive. Losing all your anti-tank personnel sucks really hard once you bump into an enemy armor column. But there's no permadeath in the game, so there's that. Controlling your GI feels odd at first, but you'll come to grips with your player model's chunkiness and the command and action menus before long. Basically, it's the same as any FPS, except you're scrolling through your inventory and action menu in real time. The controls are very customizable, but I really didn't have a problem with the default layout. Delivering commands can feel cumbersome with the lack of simple hotkeys. It gets kind of annoying having to select an individual unit for a basic task, or having to reissue the same hold and open fire orders over and over. Making up the second largest amount of the game, James Gastovski leads the special forces against the Russians by demolishing encampments, equipment and supplies all under the cover of darkness. While usually you're handling your objectives solo, you can still command a small squad to help back you up, but they lack the strong competence to carry out intricate stealthy actions, so you're usually doing all the hard work. I was greatly surprised at how much fun James' levels were. Though outnumbered, you can carry out some brutal ambushes with mines and C4, causing all sorts of havoc. You can really experiment in these missions. Finding an unmanned heavy tank or quietly placing satchel charges around an ammunition stockpile leads to some incredible firing moments. As Lieutenant Hammer, you get behind a tank crew as you lead the cavalry into battle. Tank combat is pretty fun in Flashpoint, but it can be rather annoying. As a commander, you don't drive or even fire, you give orders of where to go and what to fire at. So you're a lot more dependent on the AI's maneuvering skills, which are thankfully good. You tell them to go somewhere and they'll usually get you there unscathed, which is far better than even modern AI companions. Problem is though, there's a fair bit of delay when delivering orders, so if you or anyone else spots an enemy and you want to quickly evade them, you have to wait as they're being spotted. Hey, is that a T-72? Well, before you can order your gunner to take aim and fire, you need to wait the longest 5 seconds as you confirm yes, that is a T-72. Oh, what's that? Your current reactor got blown away? Well, at least now you know that was a T-72. Besides that bullshit, fighting with tanks feels heavy and impactful and very empowering as you destroy pathetic infantry units and flatten buildings with your ballistic shells. Good stuff. The airborne missions are unfortunately very few in number. Sam Nichols quickly goes from a Black Hawk pilot to delivering death from above via heavy gunship. There's less than half a dozen missions, and though they're very fun, I would have liked some more, especially since you only get to fly a jet once in the entire game. Still, destroying enemy convoys with heat-seeking rockets as well as having an all-out dogfight with a Russian gunship is very satisfying. And that's mostly it in terms of vanilla content. However, your experience and length of the game will depend a fair bit on how you handle the save system. When you die in Operation Flashpoint, you can load a save state you can make once per level, or revert back to a specific point, usually being the start of a level, though it may change depending on its length. And you did hear me correctly, just one save per mission. This can make things really hard, since you may have to redo large portions, if not the entire level, if you die or fail an objective. You might actually use your save state just before you hit a retry point, wasting your precious continue. The question really is, do you mind manual saving, or save scumming if you will? Sure, I'm fine with high difficulties removing the saving and retry option entirely, but why only go halfway? I don't really approve of cheating when playing through a game, but later installments would allow infinite saving, so clearly this did get addressed. Before playing, you may be concerned whether you have to do a lot of waiting around, and you're right. Luckily though, you can speed up the game. This cuts down a lot of the travel nonsense, and while it does break some of the immersion, it makes the driving sections far more bearable. On the technical side of things, for 2001, Operation Flashpoint looks pretty goddamn good. Closer inspection will reveal the blurry, undetailed textures, but the scale is simply unparalleled. The huge open environments stretch in all directions. The islands you traverse through are filled with towns and forests, all of which feel believable in size and become proper battlegrounds during a fight. There is some actual destructibility on offer, though very limited. Explosions cause scorch marks, trees can be knocked over, and vehicles explode in delightful fashion. Buildings get sort of destroyed, but it looks more deformed than anything else. Overall, the original Operation Flashpoint Cold War Crisis is well worth your time, 12 to 15 hours worth of single player, though the length will depend on how realistic you set the game and your handling of the save system. After surviving a mini World War III, you've got 2 expansion packs you can dig into that added new weapons and single player multiplayer modes. The first one, released by Bohemia Interactive, titled Operation Flashpoint Resistance, is definitely the strongest one and probably holds the best single player campaign in the entire series. Working as a prequel to Cold War Crisis, Resistance tells the story of a retired, legendary Special Forces fighter called Victor, living in the small island nation of Negova during a major political shift. The opening is amazing, with you going to work by either collecting and refueling your motorbike, or catching the public bus. It's a great way of showing off the world in a very believable and natural way. Suddenly, a less roguish goober leading a Russian army storms the countryside, sweeping away the country's meager forces, controlling the people with an iron fist. Victor, the only one with solid military experience, is pleaded to by his neighbors to help establish a militia against the occupying forces. Initially refusing the offer, happenstance forces him into leading a guerrilla army, smashing and stealing supplies, assassinating commanders, and destroying valuable equipment and infrastructure. Initially totally outmanned and outgunned, you're backed up by US support, specifically by James from the main game, and your continuous exploits unites the populace against a common foe. The concept is a great idea for a story, but it's made great by Victor. He's an excellent character in his own right. His background history is purposefully vague, but he makes it clear that war, no matter the reason, will cost lives and result in widespread suffering. When finally seeing the inevitability of the conflict, he turns around a situation going out of control in an intense and strangely modest fashion. They give you a good idea how hard it is running an actual resistance, with mounting casualties and trying to sustain an ever-changing patriotic morale. The levels are more complex and have optional objectives that can lead to benefits during and beyond the mission. One of the earlier levels have you stealing some tanks. Taking too long will result in enemy reinforcements that will hit you hard, and the more tanks you can bring back to base in one piece, the more armor you'll have for later missions. Collecting weapons off downed enemies and from supply trucks can be equipped for future operations, so being conservative with your gear can make a real impact down the road. Also, unlike the main game where if your squad gets wasted, they'll just pop up in the next mission, in Resistance, your troops start off experienced and weak, but keeping them alive will mold them into hardened veterans capable of taking on trained Russian soldiers. In terms of tactics, the missions change a bit once you receive some NATO-grade tools. Some of these weapons are pretty sweet and don't come up often in games. FALs, G3s, AUGs, and M16s of optics. Outside of the game, there's more Cold War era weapons for multiplayer map editing. Unfortunately, while these guns are cool, once you can equip the SVD Dragunov, you're pretty much good for every engagement. Why fire a less accurate and powerful weapon when you can eliminate annoying MG troops per couple hundred meters? It really makes the additional hardware redundant and unnecessary. But now you can finally select handguns for close to quarters, if you can even get that close. There's also sort of multiple endings, but only in the sense that it's basically back to a prime mission. The most irritating problem with the expansion pack is that some missions are incredibly easy and others are incredibly hard, thanks to the poor scripting and pathing of the AI. In one mission, incoming enemy tanks will never show up, stopping you from completing the stage because you gotta take them out. So you have to track them down miles away. Then another mission will be the same problem, but vice versa, where your allies don't appear, forcing you to go up against stupidly unfair odds. Still, it's a great expansion pack full of character and polish, that just destroys modern DLC in nearly every sense, concluding with a bittersweet ending setting up the future events for the main game. The second and final expansion was made by Codemasters. Redhammer isn't a bad conclusion to the trilogy, but it's easily the weakest link in the chain. Running alongside the main game, you play as a formerly disgraced Soviet Spetsnaz soldier, Lukin, who begins fighting and eventually leading a Russian platoon against NATO forces. It's a different experience fighting and killing your allies from the main game. Seriously, how many games have you played where you unironically kill American troops? These missions are more the same from the base game, and the story doesn't really matter since you know how it concludes from Cold War Crisis, and it isn't helped by the very predictable plot twists. Somehow, even though you're just an infantryman, you'll pilot numerous ground and air vehicles that honestly feels like forced variation, breaking a lot of the actual immersion. It's also pretty buggy with broken cutscenes and audio, but it's nothing to stop you from playing it, so if you enjoyed the main game, you have few problems here. And that concludes the Operation Flashpoint trilogy, an excellent game with a huge amount of content, gameplay diversity, and care that is sorely amiss in today's market. I have no doubts in recommending this game to those wanting a hard and challenging strategy game that's full of satisfaction and replayability. The game was re-released on Steam, but doesn't include the Red Hammer expansion, so you may have to track down a physical Game of the Year edition to get the full experience, which I think is well worth it.